Hi everybody, welcome to week 8 of the course. Hope you've rested well. Previously in week 6, we completed the Heckscher-Oechler model. So we covered basically 3 trade models. We will be looking at a 4th trade model after this week's and next week's work. So for this week, we will be covering the trade policy, which is chapter 8 in your textbook. Next week, we're going to be looking at some of the readings that are uploaded for you. Those readings most likely are testable in the form of an essay. So be prepared for any type of questions that would come from these next 2 weeks' work. As an overview, we're going to be looking at different ways to impede international trade flows. We're going to look at the consequences of doing such actions, but we're going to be concentrating on looking at only the effects of tariffs. And then in general, we're going to look at how tariffs have changed since World War II. And then we're going to evaluate also the impacts of trade impediments for different economic agents. We're going to look at, okay, a tariff is implemented, how does it affect the producer, how does it affect the consumer, and how it would affect government or capital owners and laborers. And then we're also going to have a distinction between large country and a small country. We're going to establish that a large country, when it takes its actions, that it can actually have an influence on demand. So those are important things we're going to consider, both for a partial equilibrium analysis and for a general equilibrium analysis. So what we're going to define as a small country in terms of international economy, we would define it as a country that has no influence on world price level. While, as I said earlier, a large country will have some effect on the world price level. So there are many ways to impose or restrict trade. Here's just a list of a few ways. The first form we're going to be looking at is tariff, and specifically we're going to be looking at the ad valorem tariff. That is where we impose a tariff which is equal to a certain percentage of the value of the item. So if it's a car that we were importing and we want to impose a tariff on it, we might say, okay, it's a 10% of the value of the car. You do get a specific tariff. Specific tariff looks at a set value. So what I mean by a set value, I mean that you will say, okay, for every car you bring, we're going to say it's $100 per car. So it's not any percentage or anything. So it's very fixed. Ad valorem tariff will change as the price of that item that you are importing or exporting changes. Then we got an import quotas. Import quotas can work exactly the same as a tariff. They can be made equal, and that is a discussion you can have in terms of your micro work for when you do micro 331. Anyways, we are just trying to limit the amount of items that are coming within the country. Then we also got the idea of subsidizing domestic product, and that can come in different forms. That is either giving some tax reliefs for a local company, or you're giving them money to use in the process. So for them, in a sense, you are reducing their cost because the company itself is not paying towards that production process. And then we can also have the idea of requiring specific standards. You can't just bring any type of good into the country. The good needs to say meet certain health standards or something like that. And then there's other forms of non-tariff barriers that you can get. So you can make the process of bringing a good in very long. So when it comes to the shores, or when it's collected at the airport, or when it must cross the border, then you can go through this rigorous process that just delays the item from entering. And that's not the only way to create a non-tariff barriers. There are many other different ways, and you can read about that in your text, or even just do a search and you'll find these different forms in that. But specifically for what we're going to be moving forward with is the idea of an ad valorem tariff. That's what we need to have in our heads. So we look at America as a forerunner in the global economy, and as a developed country, we find that the tariff rates have generally decreased from 1820. And you can find out that it's for many other reasons. And there are spikes when certain wars have happened or certain people have been appointed. But yeah, generally speaking, over 180 years, the tariffs have decreased for America to a point where there's almost no tariffs now on items. What does it mean? So they freely allow goods into their country with no issues. So the USA is unique, or it's one of the biggest importers of various goods throughout the world. So we're going to make a distinction now based on the country size. So a country is considered small if it has no influence on international prices, and a country is considered large if it has influence on international prices. So those would be, in the case of a large country, would be the USA, the EU, and China. Not every EU country, right? But almost all the large economies that exist in the EU. This is something that you need to consider, especially for the analysis going forward. So this is just a global look in terms of GDP. This is making a distinction between what is big countries, large countries, small countries, and if you look at United States, look how massive they are. United States GDP of the world GDP is 25%, and that of China is almost 15%. So this is your big players in the market. And then if we look at some of the developing countries, Brazil is quite big, 2.4%, as compared to Spain, better than Spain in terms of its GDP and that. So some developing countries can actually have quite a large share of the GDP of the world GDP. So Africa there, if you look on the far right in terms of the blue, it's less than 0.5%. So they don't really play a factor in terms of the world GDP. You can also look in terms of the continental breakdown. Just remember, blue is Africa, yellow is Asia, and we find that in general, if we look at blue, it takes up almost no space of the sphere that is put forward, and the parts that are actually taking up a large chunk of it is the yellow of Asia, the green of Europe, and then the red of North America. I mean, three countries: United States of America, Canada, and Mexico, almost dominate the world demand, but that's merely because of America. So let's firstly jump into something that you've done before. So this shouldn't be new tariffs, and that should have been covered in terms of the micro work you've done in 331. But we're going to be looking at it again. It's important for our analysis in that. So what you need to understand that we have our normal demand and supply, and where demand and supply equals, what is that? Well, that is the autarky position. It's not labeled in here, but where the demand and supply cross each other and intersect with each other, that is your demand and supply under autarky conditions. So what happens with the tariff that you impose? So you can assume there's some world price, PFT. FT stands for free trade, yes. So you have these prices of FT. When the prices are FT, what is happening in terms of how much consumers are demanding? So consumers are demanding QDFT. So they demand QDFT, that is what consumers are demanding at that price. Because it's nice and cheap compared to what it would have been under autarky. But at that low prices don't incentivize producers to produce, because they're not going to actually get so much profit because prices are lower. So at the price of PFT for our local producers, they are only going to supply QSFT. So the amount demanded is far higher than the amount supplied locally. So what does it mean? The difference between QDFT and QSFT, where must that come from? That must come from international sources. So we're going to import that difference to meet demand. That's the first part that you need to understand. So this is something that is not new. You should actually remember this from previous years. Now what happens? What happens in the world? So a tax is imposed. What does a tax do? A tax is a and we're looking at ad valorem tax. So tax, effectively, when you're adding a certain percentage onto the price, what you're doing, you're effectively increasing the price. So the free trade or the world price now adjusts to PFT plus T. We have this new world price. At the new world price, what happens? What is now demanded? The new world price, what is demanded is QD TOR. That is the quantity demanded when a tariff is imposed. But now, because prices have risen because of tariffs imposed, what has happened now? How much is supplied? QS TOR. So QS TOR is now supplied at this higher world price. By higher world price, I mean the original world price that was existing, or the free trade price with the tariff added. So now what is the amount of imports that you are now, so what the country is now importing? The amount of imports now that lies for this country is the difference between the quantity demanded under the new tariff and the quantity supplied under the new tariff, which is QD TOR minus QS TOR. What does it mean? What has happened in terms of consumers? So if we look in terms of consumers, initially speaking, they had a higher consumer surplus. At the free trade prices, they had a higher consumer surplus. Remember, that is the difference between the price and the demand line will give you the consumer surplus. Now, at a higher world price, consumer surplus has decreased. So they have lost almost that entire trapezium. What trapezium are we talking about? The trapezium that they lost is the blue block, the checkered brown blocks, and together the striped green blocks, the vertical striped green blocks. That is what they've lost under the new world prices. But what is producers gain? Producers have gained the blue block. The blue trapezium is what producers have gained because of the increase in prices due to the tariff. What is happening in terms of revenue for government? Government is now only getting, or the amount that is being imported is only the difference between QD TOR and the QS TOR. And they're earning the tariff on that imports. What that relates to is the green striped vertical box. So that is the government revenue that is gained now by imposing the tariff. But what is lost? So if we take into account, okay, this was the consumer surplus, we're removing the producer surplus, and we're removing the government's gain or the revenue, then we're left with these checkered brown boxes or triangles. So that then is lost entirely to society. So imposing a tariff as what? As ended up in a gain for producers, a gain for government, but a loss to consumers. And overall, it is lost. It is shown to have had a loss to society if we weigh up all these costs. So those little triangles, those checkered blocks, are also called Harbinger triangles. Remember, this is the case of a small country. When a tariff got imposed, they couldn't have any effect on tariffs. So this is an important thing for you to take forward. But these analyses you can also discuss about this. How many consumers there are in the world relative to producers? There are far less producers than that there are consumers. So who has a bigger say when people are lobbying? If for a company, the increase in producer surplus is a lot more felt because of the small amount of producers. Therefore, they will lobby to government to impose tariffs so that they actually gain. While, yes, the consumers feel a loss of the tariffs, but that is spread amongst how much? Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of consumers. So that big loss that occurs is felt small by consumers when it is spread amongst all the consumers. So they don't actually have incentive to lobby together and then, because individually the loss is little. But for producers, the gain is a lot because there's only so much producers in the world. There's only so much companies in a world for certain sectors. In fact, there might even be monopolies in that case. But for our case, we are assuming normal circumstances of perfect competition. So this is nothing new. This I discussed on the previous slide. There are effects for producers who gain, governments who gain, and consumers who lose. All gains by the government and producers come from consumer section. But unfortunately, there is that loss by consumers that is not made up in terms of society. And I've already discussed the idea that it's a small loss based on there being millions of consumers. And I've already discussed the idea that it's a big gain for producers based on the numbers of producers in that. So this can be a big fight in terms of political sayings in that. So this is our whole idea that producers will come together, form groups, and then they will lobby to have some trade restrictions. Unfortunately, consumers won't do it because individually they are not gaining that much. So we need to move now to a large country and look at the impact of a tariff. What we're understanding is that from a large country perspective, if a tariff is imposed, it decreases the imports of that country. Remember, this is a large country. This country has a massive demand. Now it is decreasing its imports, meaning it is decreasing its demand. What impact does that have in terms of world prices? The decreased demand because of the reduced imports decreases the world price. So that is something you need to understand. So imposing a tariff will reduce the world price, the PFT, which is the free trade price, down to PTAR under tariffs. This is only because of the reduction of demand from a large country. The analysis is similar. So once you have reduced the price because of the reduced demand, we now add our tariff to the price. So the world price that's faced now by everyone is PTAR plus T, the higher price line in SPC. So here's three price lines, the PFT is what? Your normal free trade price line, that was your normal world prices. Then you get your PTAR, which is the reduced prices because of the reduced demand because of less imports by their country. And because they're large country, this is what they fix that they have on prices. And then we have PTAR plus T, which is now adding the tariff to this reduced price because of the reduced demand. This country is large, it has an impact. So what is the analysis we have? I'm not discussing what was initial, that would have been discussed under a small country. What we find ourselves now, that under the new reduced price plus the tariff, that the quantity demanded is now QD top. And the quantity supplied locally is QE star. So that is the amount of imports that come in. But what is the main thing you see here? Because of the adjustment, because of demand from a larger country and reducing the price, there's actually more revenue gained by government. So government just doesn't earn that horizontal green part now, it also earns a solid green rectangle. So the amount of revenue has increased when dealing with a large country. All the other analysis is still the same. There is still the consumer loss, which is the blue part, the checkered brown part, and the striped green part. We still have the producer gain, which is the solid green, or apologies, the solid blue shape. So those are still things that occur. Nothing has changed in terms of the consumers, and nothing is going to change in terms of the producers. Because initially speaking, consumers were facing the free trade price, and now under the new tariff price, it's still the same price in a sense. The only adjustment that has occurred is in terms of the large country influencing the initial price drop. That is important to consider. So now you have to say, well, now you have to think, is what is the overall impact? There's something new here, right? What is the new? the little green block, that is additional revenue that is occurred, and we need to compare this to what happened before. Before, under small country, the Harbinger triangles or the checker triangles was the loss or the net welfare loss that was experienced by society. Now we have additional gain, the little green block or the green rectangle. If that green rectangle is actually more in size when you work at the area, right? It all depends how big the impact of the demand from the large country is, right? It's very dependent. But if the green block is far more than the checkered green triangle, checkered brown triangles, then we actually have a net welfare gain. But unfortunately, what could occur is we still have a net welfare loss because the new green block might be smaller in size than the Harbinger triangles. So this is something to consider. This is something you need to discuss in terms of your work. The main thing that you need to take from this is the impact on demand and world prices that occurs because of the reduction of imports because of the tariff imposed, and how that generates new revenue for government, which could cater for the Harbinger triangles or the net welfare loss that would have occurred under a small country analysis. So there are certain things that you need to always discuss when you discuss this model. You must discuss it from a producer perspective, you must discuss this from a government perspective, and you need to discuss this from a consumer perspective. Then you need to sum up everything, and then you need to talk about a welfare gain or welfare loss. Now, we knew that the Harbinger triangles, if we weigh it up against the new revenue the government gets, that can determine whether there is a net welfare gain or net welfare loss. And how you would understand that is to understand, okay, if I impose a certain tariff, what is that impact on demand that it will occur and the change in world prices? So this is something you need to weigh out. You need to look at. Government needs to take this into consideration, that choosing the tariff can actually determine whether you as a country can still gain from imposing a tariff if you're a large country, or whether you will get a loss or even a smaller loss than you would have wanted than if you had been a small country. So this is things that you need to consider. Choosing the right tariff to determine whether we can ultimately land up with a net welfare gain or net welfare loss. But having said, this is just looking from one country's perspective. We have not looked at, okay, there is another country, this is what the tariff is doing to the opposing country, or the country we're trading with, how are they going to react? Because they can decide then to impose a tariff on your country's product. So this is a discussion that comes from looking at from a general equilibrium perspective, and that's what we're going to be moving towards. So let's move our discussion to a general equilibrium approach. So we're going to assume initially that we have a small country, we are producing at Q star, and we are consuming at C star. Why are we producing, consuming at that point? Because that is the position where your marginal rate of transformation is equal to the relative prices that is implemented by the world, or that is given by world prices, and that relative world prices is also equal to our marginal rate of substitution. Ultimately speaking, our marginal rate of transformation is then the same as our marginal rate of substitution. Nothing new. This is covered in the first few or the last few chapters that we've covered. So this you would have seen over chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6. This shouldn't be new. This is a new analysis. There's a couple of things that you need to understand. A small country, usually speaking, is a developing country, and a developing country is more likely to export a labor-intensive good and import a capital-intensive good. Hence, why we started at this equilibrium position, Q star, which is a position where we are producing more food relative to manufacturers. In terms of consumption, what is occurring is that we're actually importing additional manufacturers to meet the consumption equilibrium, and we're actually exporting our excess food. This is the position that we're lying in, right? So what happens when you introduce a tariff? Where we're imposing this tariff? We're imposing this tariff on the good that we are importing. What is the good that we import in this case? Manufacturers. So what does that mean? The relative prices of manufacturers to the price of food is going to increase, meaning the line is going to become more steeper. Something you do need to take note. So by applying a tariff, the price line, or relative price line that's in red here, is going to become more steeper. Something that you need to understand, right? Any change in terms of tariff, you have to ask yourself, what is this affecting? Is this affecting the food industry more or the manufacturing industry more? And that you can see and analyze based on, okay, where am I producing, where am I consuming? What is my import good? What is my export good? A tariff is applied to the import good. And that is something that you very much need to consider. So now, because you apply tariffs and the line is becoming steeper, we are now going to produce a Q2. That's a new place of production. We're going to analyze consumption in 2 slides time. So what you need to understand for our partial equilibrium analysis, what has happened? From Q star to Q2, we are now what? Producing more manufacturers and producing less food. So we're actually increasing our production in the protected sector. The protected sector is a sector in which we applied the tariff. So that is what our protected sector is. It's a sector in which we apply the tariff. But unfortunately, having increased our production in the protected sector, the sector in which we had comparative advantage or in which we were exporting from has contracted a bit. So that's important to take note of. So for producers, when they interact with the rest of the world, when selling the product, the price that they face is the original P world price. Right? Remember, none of the foreign countries impose a tariff. It is only our country that has imposed a tariff, which affects our local producers and our consumption. But in terms of world production and that, when we interact with the world, the prices that our producers then face with the rest of the world is the standard and old P world before any distortion took place. So we need to draw that line, to use that slope and draw it to the point of our production. That is the one aspect we need to consider. Right? So we draw our original world line, we shift that line parallel, and we draw it through our new production level Q2. So unfortunately, consumers face the same issues as producers. They also face the distorted price of P world times 1 plus 10. So how do they find their point of equilibrium or equalization? They need to find it with the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the distorted world price they face now. So that can occur at the place like C2. It's not necessarily C2, it's just the point we use because it's easier to show a certain type of analysis. So C2 is where they land up, but what we can see is that at this new consumption point, that the level of utility has dropped from U star to U2. In essence, the difference between the two dotted lines, the one on the left representing production income and the one representing consumption income, is actually your tariff revenue. So determining what type of tariffs you impose will determine the gap between the lines. And for the sake of simplicity, what we assume is that this tariff revenue is redistributed to consumers. It's given back to them. So what we're going to do now is look at how tariffs causes a double distortion. So we've established that by having a tariff, it distorts the prices, causing production to shift, in this case and in this example, from Q star to Q2. We can sell that production at Q2, the amount of food and manufactures, still to the rest of the world at normal prices. So that new line that passes through Q2 represents our new production income line, right? So based on that, if we assume nothing has happened in terms of consumption, that the world prices or the new tariff on world prices not affected consumption yet, that means if we now consume at the same world prices relative line before the tariffs, we can find ourselves at a point C1. But we need to trace this using our homothetic preferences, right? This is important. We can't find ourselves anywhere else but at C1. It has to be that line drawn from the center or from the origin through to C. We need to find ourselves somewhere on that consumption line because we're assuming nothing has been distorted from a consumption side. But everything has occurred from a production side, and all that has occurred is our production has changed and our income levels has changed. It has reduced because of the distortion in prices. So we produce at Q2, but the income that we can derive is only based on the lower red line that passes through Q2. Nothing has happened in terms of consumption, so we'll consume at the place C1, where our marginal rate of substitution is still equal to the old world prices before the distortion. The only effect that has occurred is in terms of production. Now we're going to take it a step further. So the step further that we take now is the idea, okay, unfortunately now consumers feel this world price. When they import the product, they import the product now faces a tariff, and they face now this world distorted prices. So this is now the position that we showed earlier at C2. Alright? So the second effect now is the idea, okay, consumers face this distorted prices and the utility drops from C1 to C2. The first effect will be showed where utility dropped from C to C1 was from the idea that, okay, it only affected producers first. This distorted prices only affected producers first. Then we took the second analysis, we said, okay, what happens now that the distorted prices now it actually affects consumers? It causes then utility to drop from C1 to C2. And this is your two-stage double disorientation. So the first idea, the movement from C to C1 is called the production effect, and the movement from C1 to C2 is called the consumption effect, this double distortion. To sum it up, unfortunately for a small country, it has a welfare loss when a tariff is imposed. We've shown that production shifts more to the protected sector, and unfortunately the other sector is reduced. We've also shown that there's a double distortion that happens in the market affecting both producers and consumers. And in the end, what we find is that the margin rate of substitution is not equal to the margin rate of transformation, which is not equal to the original world price because of this distortion that comes into effect. So this is something that you need to consider. So we're going to move to general equilibrium for a large country. So we're going to be looking at this in terms of the exports and imports of America and the exports and imports of Britain. We're going to call America A, we're going to call Britain B. So what you need to understand, the income you generate from exports must equal to the amount that you spend on imports. So how is the income generated on exports? It's the price that you charge for exports times by the amount of exports. The same hand, all that income that you generate from that side of exporting will be spent on where? On your imports. And the value of your imports is the price of imports times the amount of imports. So this is the idea of PXXA and PMMA. The PXXA represents your export side and the PMMA represents your import side, and that must all equal. What you can do then is rearrange the equation. You can write it in terms of MA, and then MA will equals to P times XA, where P is the relative prices, which is the price of exports divided by the price of imports. So that is now depicted on the graph. That M equals to PXA is a straight line graph, and it's positively sloped, and the slope is depicted on the graph, which is which is the dotted green line. Important for you to consider. So any changes by adding tariffs is going to affect that slope of the graph. So what we need to ensure that if we want trade balance has to occur on that dotted line, because that dotted line represents the position where exports equals imports, where all the income that we generate through selling a product overseas is spent on the product that is brought within our country, or which is imported from another country. Something very important to understand, because that also adds up to equilibrium. So as long as we choose any point on this line, we have perfect competition for producers and consumers, and that is the best choice that they can possibly choose. So we can say point C would be that point. So what we have said here is that C represents a point that country A will choose, which America will choose. It's the best possible point that would represent for producers and consumers. Could lie anywhere on the line, but that just happens to be that particular point for that relative prices. So what happens now when the terms of trade increases? When the terms of trade increases, then the slope or the gradient shifts leftwards or becomes more steeper. So it goes around in a counterclockwise direction when the relative prices increases. Something to consider. What does that mean? That means the price of your exports has increased relative to your price of your imports. So your price of your imports has gotten smaller relative to the price of your exports. Something for you to consider. Huh? So again, then, when this relative prices changes, or when this relative prices causes the shift upwards or counterclockwise, and we have a steeper slope, a more vertical slope, then that will represent your new set of equilibrium for trade balance. And for country A, they could choose another value on here, say D. So we'll choose that value to be D, right? That's the other optimal point that will exist for consumers and producers to be happy. So what we can end up then doing is that for every relative price, what we can do is choose some optimal point for those relative prices. And those will give us some idea in terms of our exports that we actually exchange for our imports. So what happens now is that we can trace for every relative price the optimal position that a country would choose. Right? And when we trace all those points for each relative price, we call this the offer curve. So that basically connects all our export offers that we offer in exchange for all our imports. So in essence, it summarizes all the optimal production and consumption decisions for our economy. Moreover, it's also possible to derive trade indifference curves to reduce welfare, and these are usually tangent to the trade balance lines at the optimal points like C and D, and increases in welfare as we move to the upper left corner. And you can go check this in your book for further details about these trade indifference curves that reduce welfare. So this is an important thing now that we need to move to. We need to now show the same analysis for country B or for Britain. So what you need to understand, exports of country A are the imports of country B, right? So you can see that here on your x-axis. It is not anymore A's exports, is now B's imports, right? At the same time, all the imports of country A relates directly to the exports of country B. So that's why you see the X and Y axis have changed in name, but they're actually still the same thing. But now because the axes have changed in terms of exports not lying on the X axis anymore and imports not lying on the Y axis anymore, when we do analysis of relative prices, the curve would actually change, right? Because the perspective now has swapped axes. The X and the Y axes have changed in terms of the names of exports and imports. So what you find now that B's offer curve would actually rotate towards the right. And it looks a little bit different, but it's just because we have swapped the axis. But the same analysis can go forward. We can draw off a curve, we can plot a point, a maximal point for it. Then we can say that relative prices have increased from the perspective of B. When the relative prices increase, that is a rightward shift of the curve. Relative to country A, the line now is actually becoming more flatter. It's a clockwise rotation because we shifted axis. And at the same time, when we look at it in terms of welfare and that, then the increasing welfare will happen towards the lower right-hand corner. So what we can do now is actually draw A and B's offer curve together. So that's the first thing we do. Then we have to determine, okay, what is the world price? What is the best relative price that would suit A and B? And for us, fortunately, that would be at point E. At point E is the only time when the exports of country A is exactly equal to the imports of country B. And the exports of country B is equal to the imports of country A. So we have trade balancing in terms of the world. Every export is accounted for, and every import of every country is accounted for. And that would mean that the relative price line or the world price line needs to pass through E from the origin. This is a good part. We need to add this matching thing. So there's no surplus of anything. You could also discuss why would we not say then, okay, why not at the origin? What happens at the origin? There's no exports and no imports. What does that represent? Technically speaking, that represents autarky. And we find now that point E also is welfare improving for both country A and country B, if you look at it in terms of the trade difference curves. So what are we going to try to do is derive the optimal tariff for large country A. What we understand and what we know is that a higher trading difference curve would lie towards the upper left-hand corner for country A, and for country B it would lie towards the bottom right hand corner of the graph that we're representing. We're also going to hold country B. We're going to assume while we're making this decision, B is not going to react, that they're holding a position quite constant, that is their offer curve. And then when we impose the tariff, B will maybe react afterwards or simultaneously. So we're going to assume point F is that point where A will have higher welfare, or where it maximizes its welfare. E for them was not the best or the most ideal welfare maximizing for country A. So that is point F. So what does F do? Not what F does. What does country A do to land up at point F? Country A is going to apply tariff. What does a tariff do? A tariff reduces the trade flows. What happens when you reduce the trade flows? The proportions of imports and exports would be reducing. What does that mean in terms of the offer curve? If your trade flows are diminishing, your offer curve is actually going to shift inwards. So a tariff shifts your offer curve for country A inwards because it affects trade flows. And that's how we land up at point F. That point of intersecting. That is the optimal tariff that you chose to land up at your optimal welfare for your country at point F. What does B do? Doesn't B do the same thing? B also wants to lie at its better welfare point, which is not point E. So it might also then decide, okay, it is point G in our case. We want to land up at that welfare. How are we going to do that? We're going to also impose a tariff. When they impose a tariff, it impacts on their trade flows, which causes their offer curve to shift towards the right. Remember, the relationship is opposite because the axes are changed. So the offer curve shifts inwards to point G, causing an intersection at point G. And that is how country B lands up at its optimal position, where it gets its base welfare by imposing a tariff. In reality, what is happening? We have A and B trying to do the same thing at the same time, or responding to each other at the same time. So this is what we drawn on the graph, right? So we have A's optimal position and B's optimal position. But by both of them applying their tariffs, they are not landing at point F and they're not lying at point G. They are lying at a new point because they're doing this simultaneously, right? A wants to be at F, B wants to be at G. They both don't want to be at E because they feel F and G is better for each country respectively. So what they do then, they both apply tariff, they apply it simultaneously, and because of the interactions, they actually line up at point H. That is a new point where the two offer curves intersect. Those ones that shifted leftwards for country A and rightwards for country B now intersect at point H. That is where the offer curves intersect. And for both of these countries, this is actually a lower welfare for everybody. What could happen here? Both countries are feeling terrible, or they're feeling, okay, this is a bad situation. This country has caused us to be at a worse of situation what we need to be. They might then decide to further retaliate by imposing a tariff again to make a bad situation better and try to land up at a higher welfare, even though it's not the same like was originally, but it's better than point H. But the other country could do the same thing. They could further retaliate also and say, okay, I'm also in a bad position. So they both then apply again a tariff and they land up at an even lower position than H. When you do this analysis, and you do this, maybe it's asked in a theory question or something, you only really need to show the retaliation once. Them both applying an optimal tariff once. You don't need to go and do a second optimal tariff and a third optimal tariff, and a fourth optimal tariff. And we're going to look at these rulings governing tariffs at a later stage in chapter 12. To conclude, what we've shown is various types of trade restrictions, although we've not shown everything. We've also shown the various agents that are affected and the various ways agents might interact with each other in order to lobby for a political agenda, which would then result in them gaining from a tariff. We've also shown that producers and government gain revenue, while unfortunately consumers are the one that loses out. And sometimes in terms of the entire society, everybody loses out. We've also shown that there are overall welfare losses when we deal with small countries, but in terms of a large country, it is possible that an optimal tariff can lead to welfare gains. Unfortunately, if the opposition country plays with or also tries to impose optimal tariff, we can land up at a situation where both large countries actually are worse off. And that's why there were certain rules established, which we're going to be looking at in terms of chapter 12.